Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Professor Sara Manning Peskin presenting her book, A Molecule Away from Madness, Tales of the Hijacked Brain, in conversation with Dr. Suzanne Koven. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community. Upcoming virtual events include Carrie McDougherty's conversation with poet Maggie Smith and neuroscientist W.A. Harris presenting his new book, Zero to Birth, How the Human Brain is Built, in conversation with Joshua Saines. Please check out the event schedule on our website at harvard.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates, and you can browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can click on the Q&A button on your screen, and we will get through as many questions as time allows. This event will also have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom that you are using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I will be posting a link to purchase copies of A Molecule Away from Madness, as well as Dr. Koven's book, Letter to a Young Female Physician, which is coming out in paperback next week. So I'll be posting a link to Letters to a Young Female Physician as well in the chat. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So we thank you so much for continuing to show up and tune in, not only in support of our authors, but also of the fantastic staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And lastly, as you likely have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. We thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I am pleased to introduce our speakers. Sara Manning Peskin is an assistant professor of clinical neurology at the University of Pennsylvania. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Boston Globe Magazine, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Suzanne Koven is a primary care physician and the inaugural writer-in-residence at Massachusetts General Hospital. She is also a member of the faculty at Harvard Medical School. Her writing has appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Boston Globe, the Lancet, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and other publications. And she has also been featured on National Public Radio. And I'm going to say the title to her book one more time because I pluralized it accidentally before. Her book, Letter to a Young Female Physician, will be out in paperback next Tuesday, May 3rd. Tonight, they will be discussing Sara Manning Peskin's new book, A Molecule Away from Madness, Tales of the Hijacked Brain. The book recounts a collection of mysterious and disturbing conditions that can profoundly disrupt the human brain and the molecules that cause these conditions by dint of genetic mutations, aberrant proteins, toxic substances, or lack of essential nutrients. Annie Murphy Paul praised in the New York Times Book Review, Peskin writes about these conditions and the patients consumed by them with a grace and humanity that recall Oliver Sacks. She has a flair for the quick character sketch and an eye for vivid detail. She is a dazzling stylist and a compassionate observer. I am honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Doctors Peskin and Koven.
Nell, thank you so much. And thank you, Harvard Bookstore, for sponsoring this event. I am so excited to talk with Sara about this book. I listened to her podcast on the New York Times Book Review podcast just a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't listened to it, you should. It's really quite wonderful and a great sort of foretaste of this book, which not only is full of great content and fascinating content, but also just really remarkable storytelling. I have to say that as a longtime fan of Oliver Sacks, and even someone who had the honor of interviewing near the end of his life, being compared to him in a New York Times book review is no small thing. And I think if Dr. Sachs were here, he would agree with the comparison. It's an interesting book, but it's also a beautiful book. And Sara, I just want to start out by congratulating you, welcoming you, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So take it away, and then we'll get down into it.
That sounds great, and thank you so much to the Harvard Bookstore for hosting this, and Suzanne, thank you so much for being here. You're very much a role model in physician writing, so I'm honored to have you. So this book really started off as me trying to learn how to become a storyteller, and I wanted to tell the stories of these people with dramatic, mind-altering, personality-altering diseases. And I sort of let the word out around our department that I was interested in writing about these, and colleagues were nice enough to mention to me patients who might be interested in talking to me. And so I made a list of the diseases that I wanted to write about, and I called people who had these conditions, and they actually were incredibly nice and incredibly warm and having me out to their house to interview them. And this was back, some of them were back in 2016 when there was no book deal, I couldn't tell them anything that was going to come of it. But these patients and their families were just wonderful about having me and telling me their stories. And I think I didn't realize until then that with a lot of these diseases, people go to the hospital and they're sometimes there for a long time, and there's so much attention, and there's people coming into your room at all hours of the day and night when you don't have control over it, and all they want is to be left alone. And then you get discharged and you go home, and it's such a jarring change where suddenly you have so little attention. And for people who have very rare diseases or unusual diseases, it becomes extraordinarily isolating. And it turned out actually that interviewing patients was actually sort of almost like a cathartic process for both of us. And then I got down to writing about some of the people. And when I went to write up these chapters, initially I sort of envisioned just writing the story of each of these patients. And then the end of the chapter would be, aha, this is what is actually going on, or here's what happens in this disease. And when I wrote about it that way, and it may just be that I wasn't a good enough science writer, but it sort of fell flat. And I realized that scientific information is sort of difficult to convey without some sort of narrative structure. And there's a reason why people aren't going out and buying biology textbooks and gobbling them up. And I realized I actually wanted to tell the story of these diseases in the way that it unfolded over time. How did people actually discover the diseases that these patients had? And that very much sort of, I think, encapsulates how I have started to change how I think about medicine in general, where we all go to the doctor and someone says, you have this diagnosis. Okay, you have this diagnosis. And we really never think about where these diseases came from, who discovered them, why they are the way they are. And I wanted to actually draw that connection between real life patients and the science and the scientists who figured out what was going on with them. And then I decided to structure the book in sort of 3 sections based on the molecules that were causing each disease. And that actually is a structure that I started off with in the book proposal a long time ago. And then halfway through writing the book, I decided actually to get rid of that. I built the entire book around what now is the last chapter, sort of rewrote the whole thing over a year and a half, sent it to my editor, who wrote back saying sort of, well, this is a little surprising. This wasn't what I expected, and very nicely and gently pushed me back on track to actually where I had been at the beginning. And I ended up keeping that structure of the book. And ultimately, the goal is to convey a sense of hopefulness. I think most of what I do in my clinical practice is see patients with dementia and with neurodegenerative diseases. And lots of people, I think, talk to me about how this must be, such a depressing career. And actually, I find it to be extraordinarily fulfilling and uplifting. And I'm not sure still that I totally understand why that is. But I think part of it is seeing people's resilience and seeing people and families navigate around these difficulties and navigate around the moving targets, where what works for them at one point might not work a year later, and seeing how people can actually change and adapt to these things. And so I wanted to convey, what does that look like in real life, and show the reader actually not only that there's hopefulness in patients, but also that there's hopefulness in the science, and that we've really made incredible strides, and that we're on the precipice of a big change. So I'm going to read just a short bit from the book, and then we'll go into some questions. The way we explore cognitive afflictions has begun to change. We know more about the mutants, rebels, invaders, and evaders of the mind than ever before. A century ago, every condition discussed in this book was untreatable. Today, most of the afflictions are preventable. Several are even curable. The field of cognitive neurology has taken its first steps along the path towards molecular specificity. Cognitive calamities are now understood as molecular problems that require molecular solutions. In 25 years, if all goes well, we'll look back on the dark days when dementia still meant an irreversible march towards the erasure of the mind. We'll tell the story of how we used molecular science to save hundreds of thousands of brains from wilting into non-existence. And the people we rescued will be there with us, recalling the tale.
Wonderful. And I love how you highlight the hopefulness of the book, even as you're talking about some pretty devastating conditions. The book I think really does have a hopefulness in it. It sort of reminds us that even if we haven't gotten to where we need to get with some of these conditions, we've still come a very long way. Before we get into the sort of the science and some of the content, I want to just ask a little bit more about process, because I feel like your account of the writing of the book might be ever so slightly too modest. And so I want to just sort of ask you a little bit about this. A lot of doctors are interested in writing. We have a lot of material. There are a lot of doctors who think they might have a book in them. You did, and you sort of started out with this sort of list of patient names. You decided you wanted to delve into historical context. I mean, there are people who make a life work out of the history of medicine. How did you learn how to tell stories so skillfully on the page? And how did you keep from just getting overwhelmed by the task that you had taken on?
I think the biggest thing was actually, I had an enormous number of readers. Like, people always talk about, like, it takes a village to raise a child. It very much took a village to write this book. A lot of the readers actually had no background in medicine. In some ways, those readers were the most helpful, because they forced me to flush out what I was trying to say, to tear out all of the jargon. And in many ways, their questions made me realize I actually had explained things completely wrong. And so I think that actually having a lot of readers was probably the single biggest thing that helped me along. I'm in a writing group that has been wonderful for me. But there's no one in medicine who's in the writing group, and we meet every other week. And you can only submit up to 5,000 words. So it means you have to focus on a particular chunk. And that also was really helpful for me, because it means, you submit one chapter, or about one chapter, you get help with that. And they were amazing at saying, no, this belongs over here, and this word doesn't make sense, and you have to reword this part. And then it's a discrete thing to fix before you move on to the next section. And I wrote the book over 6 years. So it was a long time. And that also gave me a lot of time to rewrite things. And I think when I read about, what's the right way to edit writing, and so much of it is like working really hard on something and then giving it time to rest and stepping away from it. And the nice thing about something like a book is there's always a piece that you haven't looked at in a while because it's such a giant project. And I think that was also another piece that was just very helpful, is going back to things after months and then going over them again.
Mhm. So one more question about this sort of inside baseball of writing, particularly for a doctor writer. The culture and psychology of writing is very, very different than the culture and psychology of medicine. In medicine, you're not supposed to make mistakes. You're not supposed to do rough drafts. You're supposed to be fast and you're supposed to be right. Of course, we're often not fast and we're often not right. But the idea is not that you take 6 years and you fumble around in the dark and you make mistakes. That's not what you're supposed to do. And many of us in medicine tend to be rather perfectionistic and rather unwilling to show our messier efforts to others. And yet you obviously did and benefited from it. Was it hard for you to sort of take off your doctor hat and put on your writing hat throughout this process?
I think over time, I guess I gained humility, because I think whenever I would get edits in the beginning, I would always sometimes push back. I remember when my editor actually first told me to restructure the book back to the original way, I kept asking around saying, I think that's wrong. I'm sure this is the right decision. And the more I push back on any of the edits that I get, the more I realize actually they're essentially almost all correct. And even when oftentimes I don't take edits, when someone rewrites something, I don't always take the rewrite, but it's always a place that was problematic. And and ultimately realizing that even if the way that someone has fixed the error, I don't always like, if they've tried to fix it, it means there's an underlying problem. And that, I think that was sort of maybe the biggest thing. And I have to say, over time, I realized, I think writing this book actually there's a lot of parallels between that and just regular practicing medicine, in the sense that what I was trying to do here is take patient stories and then distill them down into a narrative that leads the reader to a conclusion. And the reality is, in clinic, that's basically also what I'm doing. A patient comes in and says, I bought a new car and I can't figure out how to work the electronics, or, I'm lying in bed at night and I look over and I see a person sitting there and I know they're not there, but I'm seeing them and they look really clear. And my job is to say, I'm going to take all those symptoms, create it into a narrative, into the note, and then out pops, what I think the diagnosis is. So it's actually the same process of taking sentences and putting it into narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, I have actually thought about that a lot, that parallel, that there's this sort of chaos of information that we take in and try to make sense of it. And there is a parallel there. So now to the cases. The cases in this book all involve, as the title says, a very tiny brain change that causes a very large mind change. And before we get to the specifics, what I want to know is how common is that phenomenon? Are these oddities? Are these, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, or are these things that are really happening all the time in your practice in neurology?
So I think the argument I wanted to make in the book is most of the conditions in the book are rare. Some of them are common. So one of the chapters is about Alzheimer's disease, but the form of Alzheimer's disease that I write about in the book is a rare type. So most of these are uncommon, but the argument is really that these are uncommon cases where we've actually figured out the answer. And using these cases, this is the basis that we're going to use to solve the more common conditions. So this is the groundwork that we're laying to solve Alzheimer's disease and Lewy body disease, and conditions that maybe don't yet have a particular molecule that we know is like the causative problem. So most of these are uncommon, and I think hopefully that's a little reassuring as people read the book, but that most of us are not, going to wake up with these tomorrow.
Mhm. Yeah, they're uncommon, and yet I think part of the appeal of the book is that they're very sort of resonant of an issue that affects us all, which is what is the relationship between the mind and the brain. This is something, that has been debated for generations, if not centuries. And one thing I'm going to read a teeny piece here, and just what I love so much is that I feel like you're sort of very elegant in not coming down on one side or the other. I think that when I was in medical training, it's all biopsychiatry. There's no reason for anybody to be in psychotherapy. It's all nonsense. It's all just chemicals. And we just need to find the right drugs. And then, of course, I went into practice in primary care and realized that it's actually all about psychodynamics and, the molecules follow along. But this is what you actually have to say about the effect of medications, which I think is just sort of an elegant drawing in of all of these factors. You say, since most people do not advertise their medication lists, we get to know each other without thinking of how the small molecules we ingest manifest in our interactions. We do not often consider what arguments, love stories, and tragedies came into existence courtesy of the pills we swallow every day. I just thought that was beautifully stated, and I wondered if you sort of wax a little bit, since you're a generation behind me, about what your understanding of mind versus brain has been thus far in your career.
I think my field is in cognitive neurology, so I am essentially at the seams. And actually, most of the scientists who I write about in the book, most of them did their work, or a lot of them did their work in the late 1800s, and that was really at the tip of the fracture between neurology and psychiatry. So a lot of them were actually neuropsychiatrists. That was their title. And in some ways, I think now we've come back together, and I'm very much at the overlap. So the people that I see in clinic have neurodegenerative conditions, but in some ways, the most bothersome symptoms they have are psychiatric conditions or psychiatric symptoms. And in terms of the arsenal of medications that I prescribe way more classical psychiatric medications than neurologic medications, if you could sort of divide them that way. I think there's in some ways there's this divide where we sometimes have people come in, you'll have a couple come in, and one partner will say, if you tell me it's dementia, I'll care for them for the rest of their life. But if it's just them being obnoxious, then then it's their fault and I'm angry at them and I'm leaving, or something like that. And there's this idea of if I can find a molecule, if I can find some objective evidence, then it's justified, and if not, then there's stigma. And that's one thing that we're often up against, is that sort of false divide.
Yeah, the whole question of what is volitional in behavior is really fascinating. And I guess the way I think of it is there really can't be a difference between the mind and the brain, because there really isn't anything else up there except this, and the piano lessons and the memories. They're all in there, right? So, to some extent, all behavior is volitional, no behavior is volitional. But, I think even seasoned psychiatrists, psychiatric nurses sometimes become very exasperated with behaviors that they know are, are biological. It's sort of hard, I think, for us as humans not to react that way. I want to ask you, you have a really interesting section that touches on the genetics of some of these conditions, particularly Huntington's disease. And I learned something recently that really surprised me. I was talking to a Huntington's specialist, and I asked him um, how often children of people with Huntington's elect to have genetic testing. So this is a condition that if your parent has it, you have a 50% chance of developing it. You develop it later in life. You're perfectly healthy when you're 25, and you can find out yes, no, will you have this devastating illness when you're 40, 50. I was actually surprised how uncommon it is that people want testing. You profile a young woman who did want testing. Can you just tell us sort of a little bit about that dilemma and what made her make the choice that she made?
So and this is actually a question that we talk about in our clinic. We discuss with people all the time because we see a lot of people with either, we don't see in my clinic, it's not particularly focused on Huntington's disease, but there's people who have mutations that also cause other late onset dementias. So it's the same thing of talking about someone. Do you want to know if you're almost definitely going to get a dementing neurodegenerative illness that we don't have a cure for, and I can't tell you exactly when it's going to start. And it's such a difficult decision for Amelia Ellman, who's the person I wrote about in the book. I think her thinking was that it would change what she does, and it would change how she approaches life. And she said, if I have the change in my DNA that's going to cause Huntington's disease, I want to travel. I don't want to finish school because I don't know if I'll be able to practice long enough. And it would change how she plans the rest of her life. She talked about she'd want to adopt kids. And so that's why she went. She decided to do testing. The other person who I also talk about in the book is the son of a patient with a condition called frontotemporal dementia, and his father's disease is caused by a mutation. And he also makes the decision to get tested. And he sort of thought about it. He was a scientist, and he sort of thought, his general attitude in life is knowledge is good and knowing more is better. And the other thing that he really wanted to find out for is he wanted to know for his children, because we have the technology now where if you have a genetic mutation, then you can actually use IVF and have biological children who don't have the mutation. And that really is a game changer, because you essentially give people the possibility of removing a mutation from their lineage, which is kind of remarkable. So you're not making the decision of have children or not have children. You're essentially making the decision of have children, the regular way and potentially pass on this gene, or use IVF and be sure not to. So the implications are enormous. Other issues that come up are, if we have a grandfather who has a mutation and a child who hasn't taken the test, and then a grandchild who might be about to have kids and wants to know if they have the gene, it's a little bit of a complicated story, because if they find out they have the gene, it means the parent has it, even if the parent has never done the testing. So all of these things just have these really wide-ranging ripple effects. And the biggest thing is we have people talk with genetic counselors. Both of the characters that I wrote about in the book, both of those people met with genetic counselors and did extensive counseling before they made that decision. And you have to talk about, what are you going to do if it's positive? What are you going to do if it's negative? What will that look like tomorrow? And what will it look like in a week? And what will it look like next year and in 20 years? They're just sort of fascinating conversations, and they're such difficult decisions.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask a question that often comes up in a Q&A when doctors are writing about patients, which is, how much feedback did you seek from the patients themselves on your writing? Did you show them any drafts? What was the extent of permission that was given? and what has the reaction been since?
Yeah, it's a great question. I debated a lot. And in some of the cases where I wanted to make sure that I had gotten the information correct, I would show them pieces of the writing. And then some of them where I felt like I had all the interviews that I did were recorded. And so in some of them where I felt like I had asked the right questions in the interview, then I didn't necessarily show it to people before. And I sent them all books when it came out, and the response has been really nice. One of the people I wrote about, we went out to dinner together. It's been a really nice experience, and I think especially for the ones who I interviewed 6 years ago, I think it was very different for them to see how they think about the disease process now, so far away, so removed from when I initially interviewed them, which was really right after these events had happened. But it's been neat to see the reaction, and it's also neat to see what people are doing now compared to what they were doing when I interviewed them so long ago.
Mhm. Have has writing about patients changed your experience of medical practice?
Yeah, and I think it's changed on both sides. So it's definitely changed the way that I see patients now. When I give a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease now, I basically go right back to, what is Alzheimer's? Who is Dr. Alzheimer? What did he discover? And I find that that's actually the easiest way to tell patients about what the disease is, because you're giving them a narrative structure and you're giving them a story to attach it to. And you're also talking about someone else with the disease. I'm talking about August Dieter, the first person with the disease that Alzheimer discovered. So it's very much changed that. And then I think on the other side, yeah, one of the characters I write about, Lauren Kane, she was a young woman who sort of grew up in somewhat adverse circumstances, got really excelled academically, went to an elite university, came home, and in that summer after graduating college became sort of acutely psychotic, and nobody could figure out what was going on. And her mom actually figured out the diagnosis. And even after her suggestion was sort of rejected by the medical team, she pushed for it and pushed for it. And Lauren was eventually diagnosed with the disease and treated, and it's essentially curative. And our youngest son actually was sick when he was younger, and we were in the NICU with him. And I remember being totally shocked about, I have all this training in medicine, and I had no concept about what it's like to advocate for your kid in the medical system. And I remember reaching out to Lauren Kane's mom and just saying, thank you so much. Interviewing her completely changed how I went about things and how I thought about my role as a parent. What she did for her kid was, she basically saved her kid's life. I don't think I would have known what to do in the NICU if not for her.
By that, do you mean trusting your own judgment, even if it conflicted with the medical staff? Sort of having the voice to push back against things that you didn't agree with, or how did she inspire you?
Yeah, I think it was exactly that, saying, my role is more than simply, giving a hug and holding someone. And that part of your role is your kid doesn't have a voice. And so you have to help them navigate this system that's taking care of lots of patients. And, the system works a certain way, but that, might not always be in your kid's best interest.
Mhm.
And I don't think I would have ever known what that idea looks like. It would never have occurred to me, not for hearing her.
The Q&A is starting to fill up, and please do put things in the Q&A, questions in the Q&A. But I want to go back to history for a moment. You tell the story of Abraham Lincoln's possible neuropsychiatric side effect to a patent medication of the time. There have been hundreds of books written about Lincoln, probably at least dozens written about his depression. How did you find that story and develop that story? And actually, the other historical things too, sometimes you know how you can tell when somebody just kind of looked at Wikipedia? Your historical stories do not read that way. They're just, they unfold sort of very organically. And the one about Lincoln impressed me particularly just because so many historians have kind of had at him. How did you do that? The
I think
Lincoln
part of
one.
it was to, I knew that I couldn't really tell Lincoln's story. I had to focus on something specific because I'm not a historian by any sort of training. And actually, the guy who came up with that theory is Norbert Hirschhorn, and he's a very, very well-known infectious disease doctor. He actually discovered oral rehydration therapy. So he's credited for saving millions and millions of people. But on the side, he does some work as a medical historian. And he wrote this paper about this idea that Lincoln suffered from mercury poisoning. And it's a well-researched paper. He thought of the idea only because he was reading a novel by Gore Vidal. He's a novel called Lincoln. And in the novel, they talk about Lincoln taking blue mass. And if anyone else, including myself, had read this, we probably would have just glossed over. But Hirschhorn is sort of senior enough that he actually learned about blue mass in medical school. And he knew that it contained mercury. And he's the kind of person who will get interested in something and then will very much delve into it. And that's what he did. So he started researching the question of whether Lincoln had taken blue mass. And it turns out there's tons of secondhand evidence that he took blue mass and that he used it. And there's this incredible quote by one of his colleagues who says, by one of Lincoln's contemporaries, who says that Lincoln told him that he used blue mass up until he got elected president, and then a little bit thereafter. And then after that, he stopped because he thought it made him cross. And that's really what a lot of it hinges on, is this idea that Lincoln actually recognized that he was having a medication side effect and stopped the medication. And what that means is basically that what we think of as one of the greatest presidencies of the US was sort of potentially lost to a medication side effect, which is a little bit striking.
Amazing. So I want to take a look at the Q&A and see what's going on here. So one person asks, these are rare cases, frightening manifestations. How did you deal with the risk of being voyeuristic? I think that's a great question. And the person asks, if so, how did you address that in your drafts? This question of who owns the story certainly comes up in clinicians writing about patients. How did you deal with that?
I think it's a great question. I suppose the whole time I was writing, I was essentially listening and re-listening to these tapes of these interviews. So for the most part, there was very much an image of writing about a person rather than sort of in general, look how terrible this experience is. And I didn't want to write about sort of just, look how awful things can get. In part because that's kind of an impersonal attitude. And that wasn't the message that I wanted to convey. In fact, most of the time, I really wanted to convey the strength of these people and sort of the resilience that these people had in the face of these diseases. And so I don't know that I have a great answer, but I think probably listening to their voices maybe kept me on point to trying to portray a human and not actually a disease.
I think that's actually a wonderful answer, that you were keeping their voices in mind, sort of imparted, some of their voice into the text. You certainly feel that as you're reading the stories. You don't feel like you've taken over ownership of the stories. Another listener or watcher, I should say, says, "Oh, here's interesting. Have you found that discussing neurological disorders has made you more self-aware? Do you get paranoid about your own mental state? Do you that's sort of the variant on the medical student disease. Do you find yourself assessing non-patients, this sort of dinner party diagnosis question? What do you think?"
It's a great question. I have to say, mostly from being in cognitive neurology, I have been reassured at how terribly we can all mess up while still being normal. So I think most of these things I don't sit here and wonder, do I have them? But I do, often say when I make lots of errors, I'll often turn to my husband and say, just remember, this is my baseline. This is what I normally am. And, when I go to my, a dementia doctor in some odd years, I don't want you to tell them that this is a change because I've always been like this. So I think it more have a sense of just grounding in keeping expectations.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't know. I don't often think about, is one of these things going to strike me in any moment? In part because most of us don't ever have these diseases. I mean, most of us actually do just fine despite all of these risks.
Mhm. My favorite story about that was from when I was that sort of baseline question. When I was a medical student, I witnessed a neurologist screening an older patient, a woman, for dementia, and asked her what her last name was. She said Smith, and then asked her what her maiden name was, and she said Smith. And they went around Smith, 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 for a while. And finally, she looked at him and she said, "My name was Smith, and by coincidence, I married a man named Smith. My name is Smith Smith. Is that so hard to understand?" So, someone else asks, which books were guides to you during the writing?
There's sort of three big authors. Oliver Sacks created the field of narrative neurology, essentially. So he's the one who, I think, designed this idea that you could tell a story of a patient with a neurologic disease and it would be interesting to a lay reader. And then Siddhartha Mukherjee, I think I tried to keep him as a guide in terms of telling medical history. He just does a beautiful job of the setup and then the reveal. And he builds tempo and momentum so beautifully. And then towards the end of writing, actually, I started reading more Bill Bryson in terms of how he explains science. And it's just sort of, it's lighthearted, it's funny, it's entertaining, it's accessible. And that became sort of my model for explaining the actual science meat of it. And he also is so good at taking out any of the jargon. And that was really what made me say, I have to take all of it. I really have to take all of it up.
Olive says he or she does not have a question. Thanks for the opportunity. Looking forward to reading your book and mine too. Well, thank you. That's great. What has your colleagues' response been to this book?
It's a great question. So they've been so nice. I have to say, in academic medicine, writing for non-medical journals is not that much of a currency. And so I was kind of surprised at the reactions, but people have been so supportive. They've been incredibly sort of warm and encouraging, both even at the writing level with telling me about patients. People would sort of stop me in the hall and say, "Oh, I just saw this interesting patient, maybe you should write about this person." And then now that the book came out, people have just been so nice about it, which was, I think, in academic medicine, so much of it is sort of randomized clinical trials and publishing in big journals. And this is a little bit left field. But actually, I found it's been a really nice and supportive environment. And in general, my job is I do 80% in clinic, and then I actually have one day off where I write. And that's been a nice combination, and I've been able to do that. So that's been good.
Does that work in terms of writing? Some people find that it's kind of hard to train yourself to sort of write on cue, and that, like, here I am, I got 8 hours, that can almost be paralyzing. It clearly is not for you. Is that just like that's your Monday job? Like, how do you do that?
I think, well, to be honest, some of that ends up being childcare, so it's probably a mix. But I think ultimately what works well for me is in the actual drafting something, it worked well for me to do that on the computer. And so it's nice to have time to set to do that. But then when I go back and edit, oftentimes that's sort of in the middle of the night or at a random time. And when I was in residency, I always used to talk about like, you're on rounds and there's a 97-year-old patient and someone's talking about their family history. That's the perfect time to fix a word or delete a comma. So it's these moments where you can just tune out for just a moment and fix something small on your phone. And that's really helpful outside of the sort of official writing time. And I think that's ultimately the best way to write. You spend time sort of very purposefully creating something, but more of the shaping process is going back to it when your mind is fresh and editing. And I think that worked well. The last draft of the book I actually edited on a Kindle, which I would never have imagined I would do at the beginning. But seeing the words in a different format with different line breaks and different text edits and backlit, I ended up picking up so many errors that I had of words that I had repeated or things that weren't organized well. And that was really helpful.
Mm-hmm. You said that your colleagues are now sort of, we're bringing you cases, may still be bringing you cases. Do you feel sort of slotted as like, oh, I'm the writer the doctor writer who does this? In other words, as you think about your next project, and undoubtedly there's a next project, because I tell people this is sort of like childbirth. You swear you'll never do it again because it hurts so much, and then the minute it's over, you want to do it again. As you sort of, I won't be obnoxious and ask about your next project, but is it the same kind of material methodology, or you want to move into a completely different direction?
No, I like writing about neurology. I think the structure of this book, I think I thought of it at the beginning, but during the actual time of writing the book, sometimes I struggled with it because it took a lot of effort to create that thread going through the book. And so sometimes for the next book, I sort of think about writing something that has a little bit more of a chronological arc. But I think I like writing about neurology, and I like writing about these, the history of neurology and patients with neurologic symptoms. And then I also sort of want to write a children's book, but every time I talk with the adult author who writes a children's book, it always turns out to be far harder. And I know it's like a completely different field, but I have an idea for a children's book about a wolf.
So are you talking about young readers or YA or what?
The wolf was our kids
like a picture book or YA?
4 years, so it's more of a children's book, really a board book. But the neurology one would be just an adult, sort of in the same vein as this book.
You're allowed to do both. You are allowed to do both. I think we do tend to underestimate how hard writing good children's books are. I mean, you pick them up and you think, well, the whole thing had 6.5 words in it. Like, how hard could it be? Except when you start reading them to your kids, you realize some of them are classics for a reason, and some of them are incredibly boring and nobody likes them. So there must be something to it. We have interesting question just came in. Since you finished the book, have there been any patients that you wish you had included?
Yeah, it's a great question. So actually, there were 2 patients that I had done really long interviews with, and actually had initially written their stories, and then I ended up not including them in the book because I had one of them. I actually interviewed 2 patients for the same condition, and when I tried to use both stories, it didn't really work out. And the other, initially, I had imagined that the last chapter of the book would be about a disease that we thought was caused by a single molecule, but wasn't. And then ultimately I had trouble. I went to go write it, and I had trouble writing it clearly. But the stories of both of those patients are fascinating, and I think sometimes about writing actually about a smaller piece. One of them actually has a condition that is, he started essentially, it's a patient who started having seizures and found out that their seizures were caused by a genetic mutation, but then he also had episodes that looked like seizures but were actually not seizures and were caused by stress. And that the goal of that chapter was sort of to talk about the overlap, similar to what we've talked about, between neurology and psychiatry, and what happens when they're all tangled together, and how do we make sense of it. And I ended up not including it, but I still want to write that story at some point.
It just didn't fit. Yeah. So Joshua Nudell, pardon me if I said that incorrectly, says, Sara, thank you for making your writing so accessible, masterful in the way you were authentic to the science and giving people a lens into the work that scientists do while allowing readers to understand these complicated diseases. I wonder how the scientific community can make more science accessible, particularly in the realm of the challenges of the pandemic and disagreements that have come from false science. Great question, and I'm so glad somebody brought up medical writing in the context of COVID. What do you think?
It's a great question, and in full disclosure, that's from my 10th grade chemistry teacher, who was wonderful, and I'm honored to have him on. He is the one who taught me what a molecule is. So
there you go.
So it's very nice to have the question.
Thank you, Mr. Nudell.
And I think actually there was an article that I read recently that was written by some neurogeneticists that talked about that part of the problem in the pandemic was a lack of recognition for what's not known. And that there was this idea that everyone's, losing their minds. So things are so chaotic. We have to come down with, this is what you should do, and everyone should do this. And in reality, there's a lot that's not known about all these things. And in some ways, when we come out with something and say, this is what you should do, and this is what we're telling, this is what's going on, and this is the way the science is, it actually makes it problematic for people, because when things change, they didn't get the sense that there was any uncertainty before. And I think some of what we need to learn is, how do we communicate science and medicine with a accurate level of certainty or uncertainty? And the same way as, when I talk to patients and I say, I think you have Alzheimer's disease, it's helpful if I could go a step further and say, based on our studies, when we diagnose this, we're correct about X% of the time. So that people understand that this is, we're doing this diagnosis to the best of our abilities, but science isn't perfect and medicine isn't perfect. And we want to teach people both about what we think is correct, but also about the what we don't know. And there's always that joke about, half of what you learn in medical school is untrue, but the problem is we don't know which half. And I think we have to be honest that we're not as good as we think we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like, that level of humility in this divisive environment has been interpreted as waffling. The whole business about, well, Dr. Fauci said this, and then Dr. Fauci said that. And in fact, this was information that was evolving very quickly in real time. Last question I was just thinking about your zombie apocalypse chapter. Do you think ultimately that that everything that we call mental illness will turn out to be molecular or neurological? Do you think that if we had a crystal ball and went forward 100 years, that the things that we call psychiatric or even psychodynamic will turn out to be molecular?
So is it all brain chemistry?
As molecular?
Right, like, is it all brain chemistry, or is there something higher order than that?
What do you think?
It's a good question. I suppose when I think about it, I imagine that it's all brain chemistry, but that we're never going to figure it out. And so there's always going to be something that doesn't fit. But maybe that's wrong. I mean, maybe it's not ever going to be, maybe it's not possible to distill it to a chain reaction of one molecule to another. But it does seem like the more we look into it, the more we find things are much more complex than we ever imagined. But there do seem to be, markers of particular diseases, even in psychiatry. And there seem to be molecular markers. So there does seem to be a particular molecular profile of psychiatric diseases. So maybe that's the way it's all going, but I can't imagine ever truly untangling it. That
Mhm.
sounds like
It
I don't know
just
if I'll ever be
seemed
able to.
like it's a pendulum. And if you take something like schizophrenia, and we started out with, well, this is all about bad mothering, going back to say the 40s or 50s. And, no, it's 100% chemistry. And it feels like we're moving, maybe not entirely to the middle, um, um, but a little more to the middle. And we're at the hour. And I'll just say that I think um, a, a great contribution of your book is an openness to what that middle might look like. I think it's just a very thoughtful look at what is a really, really big question. So it's a humble book, but it's an ambitious book. Congratulations again, and now I think that's your cue to give us the hook.
Hi. Yes. Although this was a fascinating conversation, and it just thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you so much. It was so nice to meet you. Thank you so much, Suzanne and Nell, for making this whole thing happen.
It seems sort of too punny to say, that it was mind blowing, but I mean, it really is. This is a mind blowing topic.
As long as it wasn't brain blowing.
Right. Yeah. Fair. Thanks. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Again, I've posted the links to purchase the book in the chat. Again, A Molecule Away from Madness. And thanks so much to both of you, to Suzanne and Sara. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, please stay well and have a lovely evening and happy reading. Thank you so much. Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.